I want you to picture a scene that sounds almost pulled directly from a spy novel. Imagine you're inside this resort, maybe North Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. Outside, a hurricane is absolutely raging, but inside, it's calm, it's jovial, it's a reunion of former spies, military intelligence folks, the old spooks, sharing stories. And the place they keep talking about, the place they're all nostalgic for, is thousands of miles away. It's isolated, high up, and was incredibly secret. Kagnew Station.
It's a striking image, isn't it? It really captures that strange contrast
Yeah.
of the Cold War intelligence world, Kagnew Station.
Hmm.
Okay, so this was a critical U.S. military base located way up on the plateau in Asmara, Eritrea. It was up and running from about 1943 right through until 1974. And it served as, well, one of the world's most vital intelligence gathering points. Started under the Army Security Agency, the ASA, but after 1952, it really became a cornerstone for the brand new National Security Agency, the NSA.
Right. And that switch, ASA to NSA, that's important, isn't it? It kind of signals a shift, moving from, say, tactical battlefield intelligence to something bigger strategic, global signals intelligence, all centralized. So our mission today, what we want to unpack for you, is how this high-altitude, super-secret American surveillance operation became so vital for U.S. intelligence, and, maybe more importantly, how its very existence got tangled up with and really dramatically shaped the history of Eritrea's long quest for independence from Ethiopian occupation.
Exactly. Kagnew Station is just this perfect case study. It shows how global power politics can pivot, sometimes entirely, on just a unique piece of geography and, a few very calculated political decisions.
Okay, let's unpack this then, because, for an operation that was heavily focused on listening in on the Soviet Union, the location, it seems a bit counterintuitive at first. Asmara, a high desert plateau in the Horn of Africa. Why there? What made it the perfect spot for spies to listen in?
Well, it really came down to physics and location, 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 as they say. Eritrea's position just north of the equator, plus that incredible altitude, we're talking 7,600 feet up. It basically turned Asmara into what the veterans actually called the audio funnel. The air up there is thin, it's clear, very little atmospheric noise or signal degradation.
Ah, okay, so it's like having a really clean radio channel.
Pretty much, yeah. It allowed the station to pick up signals not just from Eastern Europe, which was key, obviously, but I mean globally. They're pulling in signals from as far away as Finland, down to Brazil, even across to Australia. It was just this incredibly quiet place, electronically speaking.
And the sources we looked at show this wasn't just some Cold War idea that popped up in the 50s. It actually started before World War II was even over, 2 years before. April 1943, apparently. A U.S. Army lieutenant stumbles upon this site. It used to be the Italian Naval Fleet's communications hub called Radio Marina, and that spot, that became Kagnew.
And its value was proven almost right away. It became indispensable, like immediately. There was this really surprising early success in 1944. The station intercepted and, crucially, decoded a highly encrypted message. It was going from the Japanese ambassador in Germany back to Tokyo.
Wow, okay. What was in it?
It detailed German troop positions, things that General Eisenhower needed to know. That specific piece of intelligence provided key data that helped make the Normandy invasion successful. So, it basically justified the entire station's existence almost overnight. A huge win.
But then come the political decisions. And this is where the story, well, it takes a darker turn, doesn't it? Because once the U.S. brass really understood the long-term strategic value of this particular spot on the map, well, the sources suggest the fate of Eritrean self-determination was pretty much sealed.
Exactly. It's a critical point. When the British were handing over control after World War II, the Americans had a choice to make. And they chose what seemed like the politically expedient route at the time. They decided to back Ethiopia's bid for governance over Eritrea. This gave Ethiopia that crucial access to a port on the Red Sea. And, most importantly for Washington, it ensured the U.S. kept its access to what they called one of the best places in the world for signals intelligence.
And the sources are quite blunt about this. They call it, well, they say this was the first and second time Eritreans were sold out by a pact between Ethiopia and the West.
Yes, that's the language used. It effectively consigned Eritreans to the subjugation of Ethiopia's government under Emperor Haile Selassie. The U.S. priority was securing immediate and stable access to that site.
Was there any discussion back then in the U.S. documents about trying to, guarantee base access and support Eritrean independence, or was it purely transactional?
From the perspective of the U.S. leadership at that specific moment, guaranteeing immediate strategic access was paramount. Emperor Haile Selassie offered that guarantee. Supporting a newly independent Eritrea Well, that was viewed as a much more unstable, long-term political gamble they weren't willing to take. So by agreeing to the U.S. terms, Selassie got crucial U.S. political and military backing. And this whole arrangement was formalized in 1953. They signed a 25-year base rights agreement. And that agreement cemented the reality that Eritrea would be under Ethiopian occupation for the next 4 decades.
And that political decision, essentially trading an intelligence advantage for Eritrean sovereignty,
Yeah.
it directly fueled, or at least solidified, the Eritrean War for independence from Ethiopian occupation.
Correct. The establishment and continuation of the base became deeply intertwined with that conflict. And then, as if things weren't complex enough, the space race kicks off. And suddenly, Kagnew becomes even more important. The mission evolves. It's not just about listening to terrestrial radio signals anymore. Now it's about deep space intelligence.
Right, and that's where this codename comes in. STONEHOUSE. Established in 1965. The sources say it was the first site built specifically for the Deep Space Intelligence Collection Program. What exactly does deep space intelligence mean in this context? Are we talking like listening for alien signals or just satellite chatter?
Not quite aliens. It's mostly about telemetry. That's the key word here. See, deep space signals weren't usually voice communications or coded military orders. They were streams of data telemetry sent back by Soviet probes, satellites, maybe even missiles during tests. Data about their flight path, how they were performing, fuel levels, the status of onboard systems, maybe even weapon systems functionality. Cagnew's job was to snatch that data stream right out of the air.
Okay, telemetry, got it. And that explains the massive infrastructure needed. The sources mentioned, 6,000 tons of steel had to be shipped up there, and they built these 2 absolutely enormous satellite dishes. One was 85 feet across, the other a staggering 150 feet wide. One source even suggested that a 150-foot dish might have been the largest movable object ever built at that time. Is that possible?
It's certainly described that way. Whether technically the largest, it was definitely state-of-the-art and absolutely massive, a huge engineering feat in that remote location. And those dishes weren't just for show, Their main job was tracking every little detail of Soviet weapons tech development military movements, and, maybe most famously, their space missions. Things like the Luna probes to the moon, the Venera probes to Venus, the Zond missions.
So they were basically eavesdropping on the entire Soviet space program.
Pretty much. And here's something fascinating. The quality of the intelligence they gathered was apparently exceptional. There are reports that the American interceptions of the telemetry from the Soviet Luna 9 probe, that was the first spacecraft to soft land on the moon, those intercepted signals were actually better, clearer than the signals the Soviets themselves managed to receive back home.
Wait, really? So the U.S. had a better feed of the Soviet missions data than the Soviets did?
That's what the reports suggest. It implies the U.S. wasn't just listening in. They had this incredibly clear window into the performance, maybe even the flaws, of Soviet space technology. They were essentially monitoring the pulse of the Soviet space effort in real time.
That's a huge advantage.
Immense. And Emperor Selassie knew exactly how valuable this access was to the Americans, especially to the Pentagon. He understood they were willing to pay a very high price, mostly in military aid and weapons, to keep that lease going. It apparently became something of an open secret that the U.S. would grant him almost anything he asked for. There were even, slightly exaggerated reports suggesting the Pentagon would give him solid gold Cadillacs if that's what it took to keep the base open.
Solid gold Cadillacs. Okay, maybe a bit of hyperbole, but it makes the point. So we've covered the high-stakes intel, the geopolitics, the difficult origins. But what about the people? What was life actually like for the thousands of American military personnel and their families stationed on this incredibly important secret base? Because the narrative completely shifts here. When you read the accounts from veterans or their dependents, Kagnew is often painted in these really nostalgic terms. They call it hometown USA or small town Americana. How does that square with everything else?
It's a stark contrast, isn't it? It seems there was a very conscious effort to create a complete American bubble up there on the plateau.
Yeah.
The pay was good, the cost of living allowances were generous because it was considered a hardship post despite the amenities.
Right.
And they used that to import basically every comfort of American life. There were clubs for everything. Photo clubs, radio clubs, sports leagues. They even had their own TV station, AFRTS, Armed Forces Radio and Television Service. It broadcast American shows, news, even kids shows, like one apparently called Captain Kagnew.
Captain Kagnew, wow, okay.
And social hubs like the Oasis Club, other NCO and officer clubs, places to drink, socialize, forget you were thousands of miles from home. They even set up R&R centers in other Eritrean towns like Karen and particularly Massawa down on the Red Sea coast. You hear these stories, these jokes from veterans about water skiing in the Red Sea. They called it parting the Red Sea with two sticks.
Parting the Red Sea, it sounds so surreal, like a 1960s American suburban dream complete with maybe a corvair, that nadir nightmare, as one source called it, just plopped down in the Horn of Africa. Amidst all this tension, this growing conflict, how did they maintain that bubble, that sense of separation?
Well, there was definitely an official narrative pushed on base personnel that minimized the surrounding situation. The Eritrean War for Independence from Ethiopian occupation.
Hmm.
And physically, they were quite segregated from the local Eritrean population. Day-to-day life for most Americans didn't involve much interaction outside the base perimeter or approved areas. It created this profound disconnect. And you see it in the anecdotes shared at those reunions you mentioned at the start. The guys swapping stories about riding their motorcycles down that incredible winding road from Asmara to Massawa. It's all about that shared American experience within the bubble.
But we have to stress this point, right? That almost idyllic nostalgia, the bubble, the water skiing, the Captain Kagnew shows, it exists in the sharpest possible contrast to the reality on the ground for Eritreans during those same years. For them, this wasn't hometown USA. It was the period of harsh Ethiopian occupation, and they were fighting the brutal Eritrean War for independence from that occupation. The American presence was, for many, a symbol of the deal that enabled it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that underlying instability, that conflict, eventually became the base's undoing. It couldn't stay isolated forever. The inevitable end really kicked into high gear with the overthrow of Emperor Haile Selassie in Ethiopia in 1974 by a military junta known as the Derg. The entire political landscape shifted almost overnight. The Derg was Marxist, eventually aligning with the Soviet Union, and suddenly the American base was on very shaky ground, extremely vulnerable.
And the withdrawal wasn't exactly smooth or planned, was it? The sources describe it as pretty chaotic, almost desperate.
Very much so. The fighting, part of the Eritrean War for Independence, reached Asmara itself in January 1975. That triggered an immediate, rapid evacuation of all the American dependents of the families. What was left was the essential personnel, and their main job quickly became destroying anything sensitive before the facility could potentially be overrun or handed over.
Destroying, like burning documents.
Oh, much more than that. Yes, they had massive burn piles going constantly for classified documents, huge bonfires. But they also had to physically destroy the really sophisticated cryptographic equipment. This wasn't stuff you could just wipe. They had orders to smash it. We're talking about things like the KW-26 and the KG-13 key generators, core components of the NSA's secure communications network at the time.
Smashing them with hammers. Why such, physical destruction for machines like that?
Because the technology itself, the internal workings, were considered incredibly sensitive. State-of-the-art crypto. If a hostile power, whether the Derg or potentially their Soviet advisors, got their hands on intact machines, they could potentially reverse engineer them. And that could compromise networking codes and intelligence gathering capabilities worldwide. So smashing them was the only way to be absolutely sure the tech couldn't be studied or replicated. It was extreme, yes, but deemed necessary.
A dramatic end. So when did it officially close?
Kagnew Station was officially disestablished, shut down in March 1975, though the very last Americans didn't actually leave Eritrean soil until 1977.
And the intelligence impact of losing Kagnew, especially the Stonehouse part, it must have been significant.
Oh, huge. Remember that unique geographic advantage, that audio funnel? Stonehouse was at the time the only NSA facility positioned correctly to reliably receive that deep space vehicle telemetry data, especially from Soviet assets in certain orbits. Losing it created an immediate critical gap in intelligence coverage. It actually forced the NSA to turn to its British counterpart, GCHQ, and rely more heavily on their listening posts to try and cover some of that gap. It really underlined just how unique and irreplaceable Asmara had been.
A major blow to U.S. space intelligence gathering.
Definitely. And then, just to complete the timeline for the region itself, after decades of struggle, Eritrea finally achieved its hard-won independence in 1991, following the conclusion of the Eritrean War for Independence from Ethiopian occupation. And you can still see the physical scars of that long conflict. Sources mention veterans visiting later and finding buildings like the old, crumbling Banco d'Italia in Massawa, heavily damaged by bombs during the fighting in 1991.
So let's try to synthesize this. What does the story of Kagnew Station really tell us? It seems like it was this perfect, almost physical manifestation of American Cold War priorities. The U.S. expertly leveraged Eritrea's unique geography, that amazing altitude, to gain this massive, maybe even decisive intelligence edge, particularly in the space race against the Soviets. But at the same time, the very deal that secured that base access involved trading away Eritrean self-determination, effectively enabling and helping to sustain the Ethiopian occupation for decades.
That's a very good summary. And what's truly fascinating, I think, is drilling down into how that intelligence was used. That search for deep space signals, just listening to the faint telemetry from Soviet satellites and probes zipping through space, it had incredibly direct impacts back here on Earth, on human history. The value of that telemetry interception was recognized at the highest levels, globally. So much so that the intelligence gathered specifically at Kagnew about Soviet capabilities was later used as crucial verification data during the negotiations for major arms control treaties, specifically SALT I and SALT II, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaties. It proved the concept and the immense value of telemetry intelligence.
Wow, so the data pulled from the sky above Asmara helped shape nuclear arms treaties. That really connects the dots. Okay, so we've seen how geography, that specific spot in Eritrea, made Asmara the perfect, indispensable listening post back in the mid-20th century, and the huge political weight it carried. Losing that unique site in 75 clearly forced a major adaptation in intelligence gathering. So here's something for you, the listener, to think about. In our current era, with satellite swarms, pervasive global connectivity, cyber warfare, where are the indispensable audio funnels, or maybe data funnels of today? What unique locations or technologies provide those critical intelligence advantages now? And what hidden political costs, what compromises or difficult bargains might they be carrying for the nations, or maybe even the companies that host or control them?